Ambassador Eth had seen many strange things in his long life. He had watched stars die. He had walked on worlds made of crystal. He had spoken with beings made of pure light, but nothing had prepared him for the humans. The diplomat stood on the observation deck of the diplomatic ship called Tranquil Horizon. His 4 eyes moved slowly across the view screen. Outside, the cold darkness of space stretched in every direction, but Eth was not looking at the stars. He was looking at the human warships. There were 12 of them. Each one was bigger than any vessel that had ever built. They hung in formation like sleeping predators. Their hulls were painted dark gray, almost black. They looked nothing like the elegant ships of the Galactic Collective. They looked like weapons. Because that is exactly what they were. Ambassador X of the Methane Consortium floated beside Eth. Her body was a mass of tentacles and eyes, and right now all of those eyes were fixed on the human fleet. "I do not like this," she said through her translator. "I do not like this at all." Eth could not disagree. The Galactic Collective had existed for 10,000 years. It was made up of 47 different species, all of them peaceful. War had been abolished long ago. Violence was seen as primitive, wasteful, and stupid. No civilized species would waste resources on weapons when they could build hospitals and schools instead. The humans had joined the collective only 50 years ago. They were the members. They were also the most terrifying. Lieutenant Price walked onto the observation deck. She was their human guide for this visit. She was a small woman with brown hair and brown eyes and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She wore a gray uniform with many symbols on the chest. "Good morning, ambassadors," she said. "I hope you rested well. We will begin the demonstration in 1 hour." "Demonstration," Ambassador repeated. He was a member of the Silicon Mines, a species of living machines. His metal body clicked and whirred as he processed the word. "You mean a display of weapons?" "A display of defensive capabilities," Lieutenant Price corrected. "Commander Daniel Hayes wants the collective to understand how humanity protects itself, and how we can protect our allies." Eth felt his stomach's twist. That was the problem. The humans did not just have weapons. They had weapons that could destroy planets. They had armies that numbered in the millions. They had ships that could cross the galaxy in weeks. And they wanted to show all of this to the collective. "Why?" Eth asked. "Why do you want us to see your weapons?" Lieutenant Price's smile remained fixed. "Commander Hayes believes that transparency builds trust. If you understand our capabilities, you will understand that we are not a threat to peace. We are guardians of it." Guardians? Eth had read the human history files. He knew what humans had done to each other over the centuries. The wars, the massacres, the weapons of mass destruction. They had nearly wiped themselves out multiple times before they even reached space. These were not guardians. These were survivors of their own violence. But he said nothing. He simply nodded and turned back to the view screen. The hour passed slowly. More ambassadors arrived on the observation deck. There was of the Stone Walkers, a massive being made of living rock. There was Whisper of the Mind Singers, a creature so thin she was almost invisible. There were others, representatives from a dozen different species, all gathered to watch humanity show off its power. Commander Daniel Hayes appeared on the main screen. He was a human male with short gray hair and cold blue eyes. He sat in a chair on the bridge of the largest warship, the one called Constellation. His face showed no emotion at all. "Welcome, honored ambassadors," he said. "I am Commander Hayes. Today you will observe a standard training exercise for the 7th Fleet. Please remain on the observation deck for your safety. Lieutenant Price will answer any questions you may have." The screen went dark. Through the windows, the human ships began to move. They moved fast. Eth had never seen ships that large move so fast. They split into groups of 3 and 4, spreading out across the space around a dead moon. Small craft launched from their sides. tiny compared to the main ships but still larger than most collective vessels. "Those are fighter craft," Lieutenant Price explained. "Each carrier holds approximately 200 of them. They are piloted by humans, not computers." "Humans fly those small ships?" X asked. "Into combat?" "Yes." "But they could die." Lieutenant Price nodded. "Yes, they could." X made a sound of horror. Her tentacles wrapped around her body in a protective gesture. The idea of sending living beings into such danger was unthinkable to most collective species. Machines fought. Computers fought. Living beings were too valuable to waste on violence. But humans were different. The first explosions lit up the darkness. The human ships were firing at targets on the moon's surface. Eth watched as massive chunks of rock were thrown into space by the force of the impacts. The weapons made no sound in the vacuum, but he could imagine the thunder they would create in an atmosphere. "Batteries," Lieutenant Price said calmly, "capable of accelerating projectiles to 5% of light speed, very effective against hardened targets." "How many of these weapons does each ship carry?" asked. "Between 12 and 20, depending on the class of vessel." Eth did the math in his head. 12 ships, 20 weapons each, 240, any one of which could destroy a city. And this was just one fleet. Humanity had 12 fleets in total. The demonstration continued. The fighters swooped down toward the moon, releasing bombs and missiles that turned the surface into fire. The larger ships moved into position and fired again, drilling deep craters into the rock. It was a dance of destruction, choreographed with terrible precision. Lieutenant Price watched the ambassadors. She saw the fear in their eyes. She saw how X trembled. She saw how Stone's body cracked with stress. She saw how even the machine seemed to freeze. Good, she thought, they needed to understand. Because the galaxy was not as safe as they believed. There were things out there, in the dark between stars, that made humanity look peaceful. Things that did not care about diplomacy or trade or mutual understanding. Things that only understood one language. Vorse. And humanity spoke that language fluently. Eth turned to Lieutenant Price. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "What is the purpose of this? What are you trying to tell us?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the view screen, where human weapons continued to tear apart a world. "That you are not alone," she said, "and that when the darkness comes, there will be someone standing between you and it." Eth wanted to ask more. He wanted to understand, but the words died in his throat as he watched another section of the moon collapse under the relentless assault. He had come to this demonstration expecting to see primitive violence. Instead, he was beginning to see something else entirely. He was beginning to see a shield. And he did not know if that made him feel better or worse. The second day of the demonstration took place on a planet called Training World 7. It was a dead world, covered in brown dust and gray rocks. There was no life here. There never had been. The humans had chosen it specifically because there was nothing here to destroy. Nothing except the targets. Eth stood in a viewing bunker with the other ambassadors. The bunker was made of thick metal and buried deep in a hillside. Lieutenant Price had assured them they were perfectly safe. Eth did not feel safe. He felt like he was standing next to a sleeping monster. "Today you will observe ground combat exercises," Commander Hayes said through the speakers. "Our soldiers will demonstrate standard infantry tactics, armored warfare, and close air support." The words meant nothing to most of the ambassadors. The collective had no soldiers. They had no tanks or infantry or air support. These were concepts from a darker time, from before the collective had evolved beyond such primitive needs. But the humans had never evolved beyond them. The humans had kept their weapons. They had kept their armies. They had kept their killer instincts. And now those instincts were about to be displayed. The first vehicles appeared on the horizon. They were large metal boxes on wheels, painted in shades of brown and green. They moved fast across the rough terrain, throwing up clouds of dust behind them. M47 Bradley fighting vehicles, Lieutenant Price explained. Each one carries 8 soldiers and is armed with and missile systems. 8 soldiers inside that small machine, X asked. How do they fit? They are trained to operate in tight spaces. The Bradleys spread out across the plain. They moved in patterns that seemed random at first, but Eth soon realized they were covering each other. When one vehicle stopped, another moved. When one turned, another provided protection. It was like watching a pack of predators hunting. Then the shooting started. The roared to life, sending streams of fire toward targets set up across the landscape. Metal silhouettes shaped like enemy soldiers were torn apart in seconds. Bunkers made of concrete exploded under the assault. Vehicle targets burst into flames. Eth watched in silence. The noise was incredible, even from inside the protected bunker. The ground shook with each impact, the air filled with smoke and dust. Rate of fire is approximately 200 rounds per minute, Lieutenant Price said. She spoke as calmly as if she was describing the weather. Effective range is 3 kilometers. This is for fighting other humans, asked. His optical sensors flickered rapidly, recording everything. These weapons were designed for human conflicts, yes, but they are effective against most biological targets. Most biological targets. The words hung in the air. Eth understood what she meant. These weapons would work against. They would work against any species in the collective. The Bradleys finished their assault and pulled back. Before the dust could settle, new vehicles appeared. These were much larger, much heavier. The ground trembled under their weight. M1A4 main battle tanks, Commander Hayes announced. The backbone of human armored forces. The tanks were terrifying. They were massive metal beasts, covered in armor so thick that nothing in the collective could penetrate it. Their main guns pointed forward like accusing fingers. Their engines roared like angry animals. There were 20 of them. They formed a line and advanced across the plain. The main gun fires a 120mm projectile, Lieutenant Price said. It can destroy any armored target at ranges of 4 kilometers or more. What about unarmored targets? Asked. His voice rumbled like stones grinding together. Lieutenant Price paused. Then she said, unarmored targets do not survive. The tanks opened fire. The sound was beyond anything Eth had ever experienced. It was not just loud, it was physical. He felt each shot in his bones, in his organs, in his soul. The targets they fired at did not just break. They ceased to exist. Buildings vanished. Bunkers turned to craters. The landscape itself changed under the assault. Ambassador Whisper of the Mind Singers collapsed. Her thin body could not handle the vibrations. 2 other ambassadors rushed to help her, carrying her to the back of the bunker where the shaking was less intense. Lieutenant Price watched with no expression on her face. She had seen this before. She had seen worse. The tank demonstration ended, and for a moment there was silence. The ambassadors looked at each other with eyes full of fear and confusion. They had never imagined that any species could create such instruments of destruction. They had never imagined that any species would want to. Then the sky screamed. The aircraft came from nowhere. They moved so fast that Eth did not even see them at first. He only heard the sound, a shriek of tortured air that seemed to split the sky in half. Then they were gone, leaving only fire and thunder behind them. F-52 Raptor II fighters, Lieutenant Price said, capable of hypersonic flight within atmosphere, currently demonstrating ground attack capabilities. The fighters came around again. This time Eth was ready for them. He watched as they dropped their bombs on the remaining targets. Each bomb created an explosion that threw dirt and rock hundreds of meters into the air. The heat was so intense that he could feel it even inside the bunker. How many of these aircraft does humanity possess? Asked. approximately 4,000 in active service. 4,000. The number bounced around inside Eth's mind. 4,000 of these screaming death machines, each one capable of destroying entire armies on its own. The demonstration was supposed to last 2 more hours. It felt like 2 more years. The ambassadors watched as human soldiers performed infantry exercises, moving through mock towns and clearing buildings with weapons and explosives. They watched as artillery batteries launched shells that could travel 50 kilometers to hit their targets. They watched as helicopters swooped low and fired missiles at anything that moved. By the end, Eth's body was shaking. He was not cold. He was not sick. He was simply overwhelmed by what he had seen. Lieutenant Price led them back to the transport ship. She was quiet, letting them process what they had witnessed. Only when they were safely aboard did she speak again. "Tomorrow we will observe naval operations. I suggest you rest well tonight. The naval demonstration is more intense than what you saw today." More intense? Eth could not imagine how that was possible. X floated beside him as they walked to their quarters. Her tentacles were still wrapped tightly around her body. "I have been alive for 300 years, she said quietly. "I have traveled to 1,000 worlds. I have seen wonders that would take a lifetime to describe, but I have never seen anything like this." "Neither have I," Eth admitted. "They are monsters," X whispered. "Beautiful, terrible monsters." Eth wanted to argue. He wanted to say that humans were just different, that they had evolved under different conditions, that their violence was a result of their history rather than their nature. But he could not make the words come, because deep in his heart he knew that X was right. The humans were monsters. And somehow, impossibly, they were also their allies. That night, Eth dreamed of fire and thunder and machines that moved like predators. He woke before dawn, unable to sleep, and spent the remaining hours staring out his window at the human fleet. The ships hung in the darkness like sleeping giants. They looked peaceful, almost gentle. But Eth knew better now. He knew what those ships could do. He knew what the humans were capable of. And he knew that tomorrow would be even worse. The ocean world had no name. The humans simply called it Test Site 9. It was a planet covered entirely in water, with no land masses and no life of any kind. The humans had found it 50 years ago and had been using it ever since for one purpose only: testing their most powerful weapons. The ambassadors stood on the bridge of the Constellation, the flagship of the 7th Fleet. Captain Marsh had welcomed them personally. He was a human male with gray hair and tired eyes and hands that looked like they had seen hard work. He moved around his bridge with the easy confidence of someone who had spent decades in command. "Today you will observe ship-to-surface strike capabilities," he said. "We will demonstrate conventional weapons first, followed by orbital strike systems." Eth felt his heart's beat faster. Orbital strike systems. He knew what that meant. He had read about it in the human military files, but reading about something and seeing it were very different things. The Constellation moved into position above the target zone. Far below, the endless ocean stretched in all directions. There was nothing to see except water and clouds and the distant curve of the planet's horizon. "The target is an asteroid approximately 2 kilometers in diameter," Captain Marsh explained. "It was towed into the ocean specifically for this demonstration. It rests on the ocean floor at a depth of 500 meters. 2 kilometers. That was the size of a small city. Eth tried to imagine an asteroid that large sitting at the bottom of an ocean. He tried to imagine what it would take to destroy such a thing. He was about to find out. "Beginning conventional strike," Captain Marsh announced, "launching cruise missiles." The missiles leaped from tubes along the ship's hull. There were dozens of them, climbing into the sky on trails of fire before curving downward toward the target. They hit the water and kept going, diving deep beneath the surface. The explosions were visible even from orbit. Great columns of water rose from the ocean, climbing kilometers into the air before falling back. The ship's sensors showed the damage in real time. The asteroid had been hit multiple times. Chunks of rock had been blown away. Cracks had formed across its surface. But it was still there, still mostly intact. Impressive, observed, but not sufficient to destroy the target. Captain Marsh nodded. Cruise missiles are designed for precision strikes against specific targets, bases, ships, fortifications. They are not designed for massive destruction. He paused. For that, we have other options. He touched a control on his chair. Strike command, Constellation Actual. You are cleared for kinetic bombardment. Single rod, standard yield. Lieutenant Price moved closer to the ambassadors. I suggest you shield your eyes. The initial flash will be very bright. Eth did not understand. A kinetic weapon used no explosives. It was simply a piece of metal dropped from orbit. How could it create a flash? Then he remembered his physics. Velocity equals energy. A large enough piece of metal, moving fast enough, would release energy equal to a nuclear bomb when it hit. He closed all four of his eyes. The flash came a moment later. Even with his eyes closed, Eth could see it through his eyelids. It was like staring at a sun. The light lasted for several seconds before fading. When he opened his eyes again, the ocean had changed. Where the asteroid had been, there was now a hole in the water, a crater in the ocean itself, so deep that Eth could see the bottom far below. Water was rushing in from all sides, but the hole was so large that it would take minutes to fill. Steam rose from the depths in a column that reached the clouds. Standard yield, Captain Marsh repeated. A tungsten rod approximately 10 meters in length and 2 meters in diameter, accelerated to 15 kilometers per second. The asteroid, Ambassador asked. His stone body had cracked from the vibrations of the impact. Destroyed, completely vaporized. The ambassador stood in silence. Even the living machine had no words. They simply stared at the devastation below, at the wound in the ocean that human technology had created. Eth finally found his voice. You said standard yield. Are there other yields? Captain Marsh nodded slowly. We have rods up to 50 meters in length. Those are reserved for planetary defense scenarios. He paused. Or planetary assault. Planetary assault. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Eth understood now. Humans could destroy worlds. They had the technology, the weapons, and the will to wipe entire civilizations from existence. And yet they chose not to. That, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing of all. The demonstration continued. The ambassadors watched as human submarines surfaced and fired their own missiles. They watched as surface ships launched torpedoes that could seek out targets on their own. They watched as aircraft from the fleet's carriers dropped bombs that could penetrate bunkers buried deep underground. By the end, the ocean floor around Test Site 9 was littered with craters. The water was filled with debris. The planet itself seemed wounded by what had been done to it. Lieutenant Price offered the ambassadors refreshments in a comfortable lounge as the fleet prepared to leave. Most of them refused. They sat in silence, processing what they had seen. X finally spoke. Why do you have these weapons? The galaxy is at peace. The collective has no enemies. There is no need for such destruction. Captain Marsh had joined them in the lounge. He sat in a chair designed for human bodies, his tired eyes moving from ambassador to ambassador. The galaxy is at peace because we make it so, he said. The collective has no enemies because we stand between you and the things that would devour you. What things? Ed asked. What are you talking about? Captain Marsh looked at Lieutenant Price. Something passed between them, some silent communication that Ed could not understand. There are things in the dark, the captain said finally. Things that do not care about peace or diplomacy or trade. Things that see other life forms as nothing more than food or fuel or entertainment. He leaned forward. We have encountered them. We have fought them. We have lost ships and soldiers and colonies to them. We have never heard of such things, said. Because we have kept them from you. Captain Marsh's voice was heavy with something that might have been exhaustion or grief. Humanity stands on the edge of known space. We are the wall between the light and the dark. We fight so that species like yours never have to know what lurks beyond the borders. Eth remembered what Lieutenant Price had said the day before, that humans would stand between the collective and whatever came. He had thought it was propaganda, pretty words designed to make their violence seem noble. Now he was not so sure. How long, he asked quietly, how long have you been fighting these things? Captain Marsh closed his eyes. Since we first left our solar system, over 100 years now. And we never knew. No, you never knew. The captain opened his eyes. They were filled with something that Eth could only describe as weariness. The weariness of someone who had carried a burden too heavy for too long. That was the point. The constellation began its journey back to collective space. The ambassadors retired to their quarters, each lost in their own thoughts. Eth stood at his window and watched the stars pass by. He had come to this demonstration expecting to see savages, primitives who had not yet evolved beyond their violent nature. Instead, he had seen something else entirely. He had seen warriors. Not warriors who fought for conquest or glory or hate. Warriors who fought because someone had to. Warriors who stood in the darkness so that others could live in the light. He still did not understand humans. He was not sure he ever would. But for the first time, he was beginning to respect them. And perhaps in the end, that was the point of this whole demonstration. Not to frighten the collective, but to show them the truth. The truth that peace had a price, and humanity was willing to pay it. The constellation was 3 days from collective space when Eth found Lieutenant Price alone in the observation lounge. It was the middle of the night by ship time, and most of the crew was asleep. The stars outside the windows were still and silent, indifferent to the small ship passing through them. Price sat in a chair near the window, a cup of hot liquid in her hands. She did not seem surprised to see him. She simply nodded and gestured to an empty seat nearby. Trouble sleeping, Ambassador. Eth settled into the seat. It was not designed for his body, but it was comfortable enough. I have many questions. I expected you would. She took a sip from her cup. Ask. He had been preparing this conversation in his mind for hours. He had organized his questions carefully, putting them in order of importance. But now, sitting across from this small human woman, all his preparation seemed useless. He asked the question that mattered most. Why are you really showing us all of this? The truth, please, not the official explanation. Lieutenant Price looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes, he noticed, were not the eyes of a young woman. They were old eyes, eyes that had seen things that no one should have to see. Do you know what happened to Colony 17? She asked. Eth searched his memory. I do not recognize that name. You would not, it is classified. She set down her cup. Colony 17 was a human settlement on a world near the outer rim, 12,000 people, farmers, scientists, families, children. The way she said the word children made Eth's stomachs tighten. 3 years ago, we lost contact with them. A patrol ship was sent to investigate. They found the colony destroyed, not just destroyed, consumed. Price's voice remained steady, but there was a hardness beneath it. The buildings were still standing, the equipment was still functioning, but the people were gone, all 12,000 of them. What happened to them? We found pieces, bones, scraps of clothing. She paused. Whatever attacked them did not want resources or territory, it wanted food. Eth felt sick. He had heard rumors of such things, predator species that existed beyond the borders of known space, but he had always assumed they were exaggerations, stories told to frighten children. We tracked the attackers, Price continued. We found their ship hiding in an asteroid field. It was unlike anything we had ever seen, organic, living, like a creature rather than a machine. And you destroyed it. We tried. A shadow crossed her face. It took 4 of our cruisers to bring it down. 217 sailors died in the battle, and when we finally cracked it open, do you know what we found inside? Eth shook his head. Eggs, thousands of them. That ship was not an invasion force. It was a scout, a single individual sent ahead to test our defenses and gather food for its young. The implications settled over Eth like a cold blanket. If one ship had taken 4 cruisers to destroy, what would happen when more came? What would happen when the main force arrived? How many of these creatures are there? We do not know. Our scouts have detected large concentrations of them in the void between galaxies, millions of them at least, perhaps billions. Price picked up her cup again, staring into the liquid. They are coming, Ambassador. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually they will come. And when they do, the collective will need to be ready. That is why you showed us your weapons. Yes, she looked up at him. Your species has not known war for 3,000 years. You have forgotten what it means to fight for survival. You have forgotten that the universe is not kind or fair or merciful. It is hungry, and it does not care about peace treaties or diplomatic missions or good intentions. Eth sat in silence for a long moment. Everything he believed about the galaxy, about civilization, about the natural order of things, was being challenged. They had built their entire society on the idea that violence was unnecessary, that reason and compassion would always triumph over brutality. But the creatures Lieutenant Price described did not reason. They did not feel compassion. They only hungered. My people will not believe this, he said finally. They will say it is human propaganda designed to justify your military. Probably, Price did not seem bothered by this. We have been trying to warn the collective for decades. No one listens. You all look at our weapons and see monsters. You do not see what we are protecting you from. What do you expect us to do? We cannot build armies in a few years. We do not have the knowledge or the resources or the will. We do not expect you to become warriors overnight, but we need you to wake up, to understand that the peace you enjoy is not free. It is bought with blood and sacrifice and loss. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. Humanity will fight for the collective. We have been fighting for you since before you knew we existed, but we cannot do it alone. Sooner or later, the darkness will overwhelm us, and when that happens, you will need to be ready to fight for yourselves. Eth joined her at the window. The stars looked the same as they always had, cold and beautiful and infinitely distant, but now he saw them differently. Now he saw them as hiding places, as cover for things that wanted to devour everything he loved. What would you have us do? He asked quietly. Start training your people, build shelters, develop weapons, even simple ones, prepare evacuation plans for your colonies. She turned to face him. I am not asking you to become like us. I am asking you to survive. And if we refuse, if the collective decides that this is all a human trick? Price's expression softened slightly. Something like sadness flickered in her eyes. Then we will keep fighting anyway. We will hold the line for as long as we can. And when we will fall knowing that we did everything in our power to save you. Even if we refused your help. Even then, she smiled, but it was a tired smile, a smile that had been worn thin by years of sacrifice. That is what it means to be human, Ambassador. We protect those who cannot protect themselves, even when they do not want our protection, even when they hate us for it. Eth had no response to that. He simply stood beside her, watching the stars pass by, thinking about everything he had seen and heard over the past few days. He had come to this demonstration expecting to be horrified by human violence. Instead, he found himself horrified by something else entirely, by the realization that his entire view of the universe had been wrong, by the understanding that the peace he had taken for granted was built on the bodies of human soldiers who died in the darkness. "Thank you," he said finally, "for telling me the truth. Will it make a difference?" He thought about his government, about the diplomats and politicians and philosophers who believed that war was a relic of the past, about how they would react when he told them what he had learned. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I will try to make them understand." Lieutenant Price nodded. "That is all we can ask." They stood together in silence until the ship's lights began to brighten for the morning cycle. Then Price excused herself to attend to her duties, leaving Eth alone with his thoughts. He watched the stars for a long time after she left. And for the first time in his life, he saw enemies hiding among them. The final meeting took place in the main conference room of the Constellation. Admiral had arrived by shuttle that morning, traveling from the fleet's headquarters specifically for this occasion. She was an older woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. All the ambassadors were present. Eth sat at the center of the alien delegation, his 4 eyes fixed on the human admiral. The past few days had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. He was no longer the same diplomat who had arrived expecting to be horrified by human savagery. He was something else now, something new. Admiral activated a holographic display that showed a map of known space. The collective's territory glowed green in the center. Human territory surrounded it in blue. And beyond both, the unexplored regions pulsed red like an open wound. "Thank you all for attending this demonstration," the Admiral began. "I know the past few days have been difficult. What you have seen has challenged your beliefs and your understanding of the universe. That was intentional." She gestured to the red regions on the map. 87% of the galaxy remains unexplored. Of the species we have encountered in those regions, approximately 40% have proven hostile, not just competitive or territorial, but actively hostile. They view other life forms as resources to be exploited or eliminated. The ambassadors stirred uneasily. Eth could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear he had felt when Lieutenant Price told him about Colony 17. For the past century, humanity has been fighting these threats alone. We have lost ships, soldiers, and colonies. We have seen horrors that would break most species. The Admiral's voice was steady and calm. We have done this without asking for help, without asking for thanks, without asking for anything in return. "Why?" Ambassador rumbled. "Why would you sacrifice so much for species that do not even know you are fighting?" "Because someone has to." Admiral met his gaze without flinching. "Because the collective represents the best of what civilization can be, peaceful, cooperative, kind, and because those are exactly the qualities that make you vulnerable." She changed the display. Now it showed images that Eth had never seen before. Alien ships that looked like twisted nightmares, creatures that seemed to be made of teeth and hunger, battlefields littered with the remains of human soldiers. "This is what we fight," the Admiral said. "Every day, every year, every decade, this is the price of your peace." The room was silent. Eth looked at the images and felt his heart break. He had spent his entire career believing that diplomacy could solve any problem, that violence was never the answer, that the universe was fundamentally good. Those beliefs seemed childish now, naive, dangerous. "What do you want from us?" Ambassador asked. His mechanical voice was quieter than usual. "We want you to survive." Admiral deactivated the display. "We are not asking you to become warriors. We are not asking you to build fleets or train armies. We are asking you to prepare, to build shelters, to develop evacuation plans, to stop pretending that the darkness will never come." "And if we do this," X asked, "if we prepare as you suggest?" "Then when the storm comes, and it will come, your people will have a chance. You will have time to run while we hold the line. You will have resources to hide while we fight and die." The Admiral's eyes swept across the room. "That is all we can offer you. A chance. The rest is up to you. Eth stood. He had not planned to speak, but the words came anyway, rising from somewhere deep inside him. I have spent 3 days watching your weapons, 3 days being terrified of what humanity can do, 3 days questioning everything I believed about the universe. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But I have also spent 3 days learning about the threats you face, learning about the sacrifices you make, learning about the darkness that you hold back so that species like mine can live in the light. The other ambassadors turned to look at him. He could feel their eyes on his back, their confusion and fear and uncertainty. My people abolished war 3,000 years ago. We believed it was beneath us. We believed that any species capable of reaching the stars would naturally evolve beyond violence. He shook his head slowly. We were wrong, not because violence is good or necessary, but because we forgot that peace must be defended. We forgot that freedom has a price. Admiral watched him with an expression Eth could not read. I cannot speak for the entire collective, he continued, but I can speak for myself. And I say this, humanity is not our enemy. Humanity is our shield. They stand in the darkness so that we can stand in the light. They die so that we can live. He turned to face the other ambassadors directly. We have been blind, willfully, deliberately blind. We have looked at human weapons and seen only violence. We have not seen the courage. We have not seen the sacrifice. We have not seen the love that drives them to protect strangers they have never met. X's tentacles unfolded slightly. What are you suggesting, Ev? I am suggesting that we wake up, that we stop hiding from the truth, that we accept the gift humanity is offering us and prepare for the storm that is coming. He looked at Admiral, and I am suggesting that we thank them, not just with words but with actions, with partnership, with the recognition that they are the best of us, not the worst. The room was quiet for a long moment, then slowly rose to his full height. His stone body creaked and groaned, but his voice was strong. I stand with Ambassador Eth. The stone walkers will prepare. Optical sensors flashed. The silicon mines will analyze the threat data and develop defensive protocols. One by one, the ambassadors spoke. Not all of them agreed. Some remained skeptical. Some were still too frightened to think clearly, but more than half committed to taking action, to waking up, to preparing for the darkness. Admiral allowed herself a small smile. That is more than we hoped for. Eth approached her as the other ambassadors filed out. Thank you, he said quietly, for showing us the truth, even though you knew we would not want to see it. The Admiral nodded. The truth is never easy, but it is necessary. What happens now? Now we continue, we fight, we protect, we hold the line for as long as we can. She looked out the window at the stars. And we hope that when the final battle comes, we will not face it alone. Lieutenant Price appeared at Eth's side. She held out a small data chip. Training materials, she said, basic defensive tactics, emergency protocols, shelter construction, she shrugged. Just in case your people want to start somewhere. Eth took the chip. It was tiny, almost weightless, but it felt like the heaviest thing he had ever held. Thank you, Lieutenant. She smiled. It was a real smile this time, warm and genuine. Thank us by staying alive, Ambassador. The universe is dark enough. It needs more species like yours. Kind ones, peaceful ones. The darkness does not need any help winning. He watched her walk away, this small human woman who carried the weight of civilizations on her shoulders, who fought and bled and died so that strangers could live in peace. Perhaps, Eth thought, humanity was not the monster their history suggested. Perhaps they were something far more rare and precious. Guardians, protectors, wolves who had chosen to defend the sheep instead of hunting them. He boarded his shuttle, the data chip clutched in his hand, and began composing his report to the High Council. The message would be difficult to deliver. Many would not want to hear it. Some would call him a coward or a traitor or a fool. But the truth did not care about comfort. The truth simply was. And the truth was this: the galaxy was far more dangerous than anyone had believed. There were things in the darkness that wanted to consume everything good and kind and peaceful. There were monsters beyond imagination waiting to devour them all. But there were also humans. And as long as humanity stood watch, there was hope. Eth looked out the window as his shuttle lifted off from the constellation. The human flagship hung in the darkness, surrounded by its fleet of warships. They looked like predators, like killers, like the most dangerous things in the universe. But Eth knew better now. They were guardians, and he was grateful for them. The shuttle jumped to faster than light travel, carrying him back to a home that would never feel quite the same. Back to people who would need to change or die. Back to a future that was uncertain and frightening and full of danger. But also full of hope. Because humanity was watching the darkness. And humanity would not let it win.